I sometimes like to go for a walk later in the evening after work to clear my head from the stresses of the day. The other night, when I was returning home from one of these walks, I was about to enter my apartment block when I saw my neighbor heading towards the communal bin area that sat at the end of the car park in front of my apartment. It was getting dark at this point, but I could make out that he was carrying a large black bin bag over his shoulder. He seemed to be struggling with the weight of the bag and had to pause a couple of times to readjust his grip. But eventually, he reached the enclosure where the bin sat and disappeared behind the high wooden fence. I stood staring at the enclosure, slightly puzzled at what could have been in that bag. After a few moments passed, I shrugged and headed inside. I headed up the stairs to my floor, and as I was turning the key in the lock of my front door, I felt the presence of someone behind me. I whirled round to see my neighbor unlocking his own door directly across from me. He paused and smiled at me widely before quickly slipping inside his apartment and locking the door. I heard a heavy deadbolt slide into place behind the wood. I released a breath I hadn't realized I had been holding. How had I not heard the guy coming up the stairs behind me? It was creepy how silently he could move. I shook myself slightly in an effort to dispel the prickly feeling of unease that had settled on the back of my neck. I finished unlocking my door and darted inside, locking and drawing the chain behind me. I always felt something was off about my neighbor. He had only moved in a few months ago, but on the handful of occasions he had been leaving his apartment at the same time I was, he would smile that creepy smile at me and tell me to take care out there, especially at night. The guy must have been watching me when I left the block for my evening walks. It sent shivers down my spine, and I did my best to avoid coming into contact with him. Luckily, I don't live alone. I share a two-bed apartment with a male friend of mine. As I'm sure we all are aware of how expensive living costs are, it helps to be able to split the bills with someone I trust. For the sake of this story, I will call my roommate Bud. I have been friends with Bud for years, and I had just days previously confided in him my concerns over the neighbor. Bud, being the good friend he was, had started to stand watch at the door when I left the apartment, particularly when I went on my evening walks just in case the neighbor was around. I felt safer that way, and I wanted to avoid getting into an awkward conversation with the creeper that lived across the hall. That night had been no different, but I hadn't expected the neighbor to appear when I was getting back from my walk. Bud came out of his room when I stumbled into the hallway and asked what was wrong. I told him everything I had seen. He looked confused for a moment but told me not to worry over what the neighbor was doing. He even joked that maybe the guy had been carrying a body in that bag. Bud got a smack in the arm for that joke. A few hours later, I was lying on the sofa watching a movie with the lights turned off. I had the volume low as Bud had already gone to bed, and I didn't want to wake him. It was also a fairly warm night, so I had the living room window cracked open to let in the breeze. As time passed, and I felt my eyes begin to droop, I was startled to full awareness by the sound of something dragging across the asphalt outside. I sat there, stock still, as the dragging sound continued. A few more moments passed, and I slowly slipped off the sofa and crawled across the floor to the window. I peered through a gap in the curtain, where I hadn't closed them properly. It took a moment for my eyes to focus, but I could see a figure down in the car park, dragging a big black bin bag behind him. He appeared to be struggling with whatever was inside, but was slowly inching his way across the car park and towards the bin enclosure. I continued to watch as he struggled, and then eventually drew to a stop next to the fence of the enclosure. The breeze had picked up outside, and the hood that had been covering the head of the figure was blown back, revealing a familiar mop of hair and side profile. It was the neighbor once again. He quickly pulled the hood back up, clearly not wanting to be recognized by anyone who may have been peering out of their window this late at night. He bent down and with a surge of strength lifted up the bag with two hands and using the momentum of the movement tossed the bag over the fence where it landed with a sickening thud in one of the many metal skips. I reflexively pulled the curtains all the way shut and gasped when I realized what I had done. I prayed it had been too dark for my neighbor to see the movement. Seconds later, I heard the door to the block slam shut. I sat there in silence, waiting. I was so scared he knew I had seen him disposing of what I don't know, but my mind was quick to supply me with images of cut-up limbs and lifeless bodies, with wide, glazed-over eyes. I screwed my eyes shut and rubbed my eyes and forehead in an effort to ward off the unwelcome images flooding my mind. Steeling myself, I got up off the floor and tiptoed down the hall to the front door. Without turning on any lights, I peered through the peephole. I quickly covered my mouth to muffle my scream. Stood dead center of the hallway outside my front door was the neighbor. His hood was still pulled over his head and his gloved hands were loose by his sides. As if sensing my presence, or perhaps he had heard my muffled scream, he looked up and his eyes locked with mine. Now I know a peephole only works one way, but it felt as if he was staring directly into my eyes. Once again, that wide, creepy smile crept onto his face, and in a movement too fast for my eyes, he leaped forward, his face now pressed up against the peephole. He tried the door handle, and I screeched, my own hands clamping on the handle to stop it from moving. He let out a low growl and moved away from the door. He looked back once more, that creepy, almost sadistic smile still stuck on his face before darting out of sight. I backed away from the door and hurried back into the living room, hiding behind the sofa. I knew I should have woken up Bud and told him what happened, but I was too scared to move from that hiding spot. Minutes tick by, and I hear the front door to the block swing shut once again. I dare to creep forward back to the window and peek outside. I see a figure stuffing a large object into the boot of a car. Again, if sensing my watching, the figure looks up, pulling down his hood and smiling that creepy grin at me. He brings a finger to his lips, as if asking me to keep a secret. I was so struck by the childish gesture that I could only watch in shock as he shut the boot, got in the driver's seat, and pulled out of the car park. This was 3 days ago. My neighbor has since bought a new car. He's also now always stood outside in the car park, smoking a cigarette whenever I try to leave the block to take a walk. I've stopped going out at night, fearful of what would happen if he caught me alone on a dark street. He's watching me more than ever now, but I haven't told a soul what I saw that night. I think my neighbor may be a killer, maybe even a serial killer, and I'm scared I'll be his next victim. I've started only leaving the apartment for work and asking Bud to walk me out. He looks at me in concern every time I ask, but knows better than to push me when I'm not ready to talk. I'm already looking for a new place to live, though I haven't told my roommate yet. I need to get away before he gets me. Be wary of your neighbors, guys, as you never know just what kind of monster may be living next door to you.
This story is from 2020 during the pandemic and is narrated in that year. I moved into a new home earlier this year with my eldest brother, and up until a few weeks ago, it's been great. World pandemic aside. For context, my home is an end terrace, so my house is right next to the entryway, with a long gravel path running along the left side of our house and snaking down the back of the row of houses. My street is relatively quiet, save for the noisy Irish matriarch that lives next door. It all started one weekday afternoon. I am fortunate enough that with my job, I have been able to work from home. There's a small area that branches off my living room where I have set up a mini office. It works great, as it gives me a separate work area that's set apart from my living room. Anyway, it was around 3 p.m., and with a few more hours to go until I would finish my work for the day, I headed into the kitchen to make a cup of tea. A few minutes later, hot beverage in hand, I re-entered the living room. Just as I was about to turn the corner and head back to my desk, a strange feeling came over me. That feeling of being watched. I turned my head and looked at the large living room window that overlooked our street. I yelped and dropped my cup as I stood there, face pressed against the glass and trying to peer in through the gaps in the blinds, was an old man. I locked eyes with him. He smiled wide at me before, moving back from the glass and out of sight. Unnerved at what just happened, I edged my way closer to the window and peeked through the blinds. He was now standing at the bottom of the drive, still staring, but no longer smiling. He was a skinny man, fairly tall and dressed in shabby clothing, with wild white hair and dark piercing eyes. As I got a good look at him, I heard an elderly woman's voice call him to get back inside. At the woman's voice, he slowly turned and walked across the street. The old woman shouted at him for going outside without her knowing, and she ushered him back inside. It was almost comical at that moment that this frail-looking woman, who was a good foot and a half shorter than him, was manhandling him back into the house. As the door closed behind them, I let out a breath and shook my head. That was creepy as heck, I thought. But I tried to push it to the back of my mind as I still had work to do. I told myself it was just a harmless old man, a creepy old man spying on me. But harmless nonetheless. A few days passed. I hadn't mentioned the incident to my brother, as when he got home from his job, he would be tired and would retreat straight to his room, so I didn't want to bother him. Once again, it was a weekday afternoon. I had called it a day early with my work, having completed everything I needed to do that day, and was sprawled on the sofa, scrolling through my phone. My back was to the window, and the blinds were open. The house was silent. But then I started to hear a soft tapping noise directly behind me. I froze in my seat and listened as the tapping continued. I slowly sat up and turned to face the window, and lo and behold, my creepy elderly neighbor was back, peering through the blinds and tapping a skinny finger against the glass. I shrieked and shouted for my brother to come downstairs right now. My brother came barreling down the stairs, but of course, the man had once again moved away from the window and out of sight. My brother asked me what was wrong, and I told him that I caught the neighbor staring at me through the window, and it wasn't the first time it had happened. He was angry and immediately went outside and over the street to knock on our neighbor's door. I watched from the safety of our doorway as the couple's door opened and the frail-looking old woman answered. I watched as my brother hurled angry words at her and she bowed her head in apology. As this was happening, the man suddenly appeared in front of our open doorway, clearly having come from the entryway, and startled me. I quickly shut the door in his face, frightened by the crazed look in his dark eyes. Moments later, I heard the bellow of my brother's voice just outside our front door, and the door opened, and my brother came inside. He was breathing heavily, likely from all that shouting and having sprinted back across the street. He locked the door behind him and told me he had told the man and the old woman to stay the hell away from our house, or he would call the police. Seeing the fear on my face, he patted my shoulder awkwardly, his way of comforting me. A few weeks passed by, and luckily there had been no more incidents. We had a rare day of sunshine, so I had decided to hang some of the laundry out on the washing line. Again, it was about mid-afternoon, and I was enjoying having some time outside in the garden. I leaned down to lift a bedsheet from the basket and proceeded to hang it on the line and peg it in place. As I turned back to grab the next item, my eyes caught movement to the left of me. Looking up, I was horrified to find myself eye to eye with the crazy old man from across the street. He was peering over what is easily a 6-foot fence from the entryway next to the house. I stared at him transfixed. I heard the scratching of fingernails on the wood of the fence, as if he was clawing at it in an attempt to get to me. I shook off my stupor, and with more bravery than I thought possible, I screamed at the guy to get the hell away from me. He jumped slightly, surprised by the volume of my voice. His eyes squinted slightly as if appraising me, and as quickly as he had appeared, he slid out of sight. I stood there a few moments longer, and was relieved when I finally heard the crunch of gravel that meant he was walking away. I called the police after that, but as he hadn't done anything to me or my home, there wasn't much they could do. After that, we decided to get a gate installed at the bottom of our drive, with a lock, so he wouldn't be peering into the living room window anymore. I've also spoken to some of the other neighbors, who all have stories of their own of the creepy antics of this old man. Seems he has a habit of escaping the watchful eye of his wife and prowling the street and surrounding neighborhood. Luckily, he has never done anything, but his actions are creepy nonetheless. I caught wind of a neighbor's conversation the other day that his wife was looking to put him into a care home. No incident has happened since then, and I hope it stays that way. Sometimes I think the scariest thing in this world is some of the people that live in it. I'm 21 right now, but the incident I'm writing about took place when I was 13. I was a 13-year-old girl who was a huge horror movie buff. Still am. I loved scaring people, mostly my friends and family. I always thought that if I ever came across something straight out of a horror movie, I would be perfectly fine and probably laugh it off or save the day. Well, I was wrong. This story took place at a townhouse I used to live at with my family. My step-siblings were at their mom's house and my mom was working, so it was just me and my dad home. I was in my room, writing a novel that I had been working on. He was downstairs watching something on TV. Now, this wasn't uncommon because I was used to having hardly anyone at the house. So, like usual, I wrote my novel for what seemed like hours. When midnight rolled around, something changed. It was like the air in the room was different. Goosebumps suddenly appeared on my skin. The hairs on my neck began to rise. My stomach began to twist. For whatever reason, I had this horrible feeling. It was as if I knew that something bad was about to happen, though I wasn't sure how. This sudden fear crept over me. A little voice inside my head told me not to look out the window. The window was right beside my bed, but I looked outside anyway. My room faced the backyard of my house. There were some trees and bushes in between our backyard and our neighbor's deserted backyard. To be honest, I was pretty sure that the house was deserted. I had never seen anyone ever enter or leave the house whatsoever. That night, though, I was greeted by something unfamiliar. Well, Someone unfamiliar. It was a boy. He looked like he was younger than me, around 10 years old. I couldn't tell what he was wearing because it was so dark. I remember he had his dark bangs over his eyes, as if he was trying to cover them. He looked around his backyard, then suddenly up at me. My heart stopped in my chest. Fear struck me, leaving me unable to move or speak. The boy continued to stare up at me for a few seconds before another figure suddenly appeared. It was a man who seemed to be in his 40s. I don't remember what he looked like. All I remember is that he looked very angry. The boy tore his eyes off of me and glared at the man. Suddenly the two were arguing, though I wasn't sure why. The man grabbed the boy's arm, but the boy tried to pull away. Everything seemed to happen so fast. Almost like it was out of nowhere, the man pulled a shotgun from behind his back. My eyes widened in horror, and I held my breath. Just like that, the man shot the boy dead center. I didn't realize this, but I had begun screaming. The man turned to my direction and looked up at me. Suddenly, I felt something grab me from behind and pull me from the window. I continued to scream until I saw who it was. It was my dad. Apparently, I had been screaming at the top of my lungs. He calmed me down before asking me what happened. I told him what happened while shaking. I remember the look on my dad's face. It was one that I can't forget. It was a mix of true horror and worry. What he said next made my blood run cold. "Skylar, there was no gunshot. In fact, there's nobody even living in that house anymore." He then began to tell me the story of how 40 years ago there was a family that once lived there. One night, the boy and his father got into an argument. Apparently, the father had his gun on him and shot his son point blank. The cops were called, and apparently it was all over the news back then. I never once had read the paper before then, nor looked up scary stories online, because I had no computer and I didn't have a cell phone. After that, I stopped trying to scare people. My family and I moved within the year, and we never spoke about that since. I'm still a horror buff, but I'm not as naive and fearless as I once was. I never once saw the dead boy or his father again, and I'm glad that's the case.